evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Embassy of India, it's my privilege to welcome you all. And we have a very special guest amidst us today. Mr. Kenneth Robbins, a psychiatrist, a collector, an archivist, a scholar, and in all these identities, a very, very special friend of India. He has a list of varied interests, including local and regional Indian rulers and Indian minority groups like Jews and African Muslims. Dr. Robbins has edited 3 books, African Elites in India, Jews and the Indian National Art Project, and Western Jews in India. And he's also the co-author of Jewish Heritage of the Deccan. He's currently working on multiple volumes, including Muslims and Jews in South Asia, Indian Jews in the movies, Holocaust-era refugees in India, Africans in India, and Maharajas and Nawabs of Gujarat. He has organized a number of scholarly conferences and curated many exhibitions on Indian history, art, medicine, philately, religion, and cinema. His exhibit on African generals and rulers in India has been shown at the United Nations and elsewhere throughout the world. His latest shows, produced for the Indira Gandhi National Center for the Arts, is a comprehensive history of Indian Jewish communities and the numerous contribution of Jews to life in South Asia. His second conference on Sufis in South Asia is planned for later this year. But his oldest friend in the embassy is none other than the Ambassador of India, Mr. Navtej Sarna. And to give a warmer and a more personal introduction, may I humbly request His Excellency to say a few words.
Good evening, everybody. And it gives me great joy to be here today to be part of this series of talks and to be welcoming once again after so many years. When we had him speak here, I think about 17 or 18 years ago when I was here, once again, Ken Robbins and his family, Joyce, his son and his grandchildren, you're welcome here. This is your home. And I was very keen that I should be able to find an evening on which Ken was free and I was free and we could do this together. I think when I go back to my earliest days in Washington, arrived here about 20 years ago for the first time. I think the memory of my first interaction with Ken and Joyce is still very fresh. And they invited us to this lovely house, which showed the breadth and the depth of Ken's pursuits, intellectual interests, artistic endeavors, all in one. Thereafter, I have used him as a one-point contact for anything that I want to know. Some people have Google, I have Ken Robbins. So whether it was anything to do with India's princely history, whether it was anything to do with the Jewish heritage in India, and I had a lot to do with it because I did spend time in Israel as India's ambassador, whether it was to do with Jewish heritage anywhere else in the world, whether it was to do with a lot of our own colonial history. There's nothing that you can send to Ken which doesn't come back fully enriched. And if he can't tell you exactly himself, he has always been good enough to point me in the direction of the person who will be able to answer those questions. So I have made many friends through Ken in museums, in libraries, in research institutions. So he is a very, very special resource for us. He's a very special friend. He's somebody, despite his huge commitments to his own work, always puts the other person's work above his own, which is a very rare quality. You will not find an email unanswered. This is something which I can't claim. And you will find that if you tell him something, he takes it seriously, he looks into it, he wants to know more about it. And the fact that we have this gathering today, even, as I'm speaking, I'm looking at old familiar faces, friends. This gathering itself is very special, and I don't think we'd be able to get all of you together here for any other speaker but Ken Robbins. So I'm going to let him have a go at us, and then I'm sure there'll be a very interesting interactive session which I look forward to. Ken, welcome.
This part of the speech will be much shorter, ditto and twice as much. The ambassador has always been very kind, and during the lecture, I'm going to talk about some of those kindnesses. And those of you who know him know that India is a place where we have so many scholars in the diplomatic corps. We had somebody here who spends their time translating ancient Chinese literature into Tamil. Somebody who's an opera singer. I mean, they're amazing. But Navtish is a multiple threat as a novelist and as a scholar, and the things that he's written and the essays that he's written, they're really something special. So I thought what we might start with is some sort of idea as to how people are greeted in India. You've already heard the statement that India has been very friendly to Jews, and it's been the only country in the world where Jewish history has not been defined in terms of anti-Semitism. So if I called somebody, sorry, what about you? Now, how would you greet, if you met a Jewish person, how would you greet them?
Oh, very easy. And this is how I would start. Hava Nagila, Hava Nagila, Hava Nagila ven nismecha. Hava Nagila, Hava Nagila, Hava Nagila ven nismecha. Hava neranena, Hava neranena. Hava neranena ven nismecha. Hava neranena, Hava neranena. Hava neranena ven nismecha. Uru achim balav samea, uru achim balav samea, uru achim balav samea, uru achim balav samea, uru achim balav samea. Hava nagila, hava nagila, hava nagila ven nismecha. Well, that's how I would greet, sir. Thank you.
Always a friendly greeting in India. But one of the things that's very true about India is that if you meet somebody within a half an hour, you're lifelong friends. And the way you tell this is they put the 3-year-old in your lap and say, "Go to uncle." And the kid is always crying, but usually in a few minutes he... So I thought that I would turn the tables and ask my own grandchildren to address you. Starting with my oldest granddaughter, Madeline, who's going to say a few words about the speech.
Our grandfather's main interest is with Maharajas, and yet he also works on small Indian minority groups like African Muslims and Jews. India is the only place in the world where Jewish life has not been defined by anti-Semitism. He will take a very, very complicated and confusing path to describe how rulers in South India accepted and favored Jews through the centuries. That story centers around the mystery of the Guru and Babu the Jew.
Babu the Jew, okay.
He has written about more than a dozen Jewish female artists in India. He has picked two of these artists as examples of the many individuals, as the many individual Jews who have been involved with other religious traditions as Jubus, Hindus, and Mujus.
And next, I'd like to call on my youngest granddaughter, Isabel, who's been waiting to say something to you as well.
My grandfather's house is packed like a shoe. He has so many Indian things. He knows what he has to do. He thinks he is a fairy godfather. Each Indian thing becomes a Cinderella to him. It becomes a princess in one of his Indian stories.
And my grandson, Ty, would like to say a few words to you as well.
Hundreds of objects in his collection have been used as photographs in his books. His books tell the stories of individual Indians and foreign Jews who have made so many contributions to Indian architecture, art, movies, medicine, politics, and military history, as well as to other religions. Travelers can visit different Jewish communities in India using his guidebook.
Thank you. Ty, why I have you up here, if I ask you to look around the room and find a picture of an Indian Jew on the wall here, do you think you could do it?
Yes.
Well, could you go and show the people? Anne Fleury, who just died at age 107, was a Hungarian Jew married to B.K. Nehru. Okay. Let me see how well I can do without the, oh, there it is. There we go. Okay, so the first question is, if you have 1 billion or more people, why would you talk about Maharajas and Jews? Well, there were hundreds of Maharajas. The official number was 562 states. And there was never more than 30,000 Jews in India. So, and for every Jew who was in India, somebody has written 3 books. So how am I going to find something that would be of interest and of importance? And how did this all happen? My collecting started with Indian paintings. I saw Indian paintings on Madison Avenue and fell in love with them. And it was a very easy sort of thing. I had really no background. My father is a mechanic in New York. The only Indian I'd ever met was Tonto. And it really was not a high time. I went to my first Indian concert. We got free tickets when I was at college at Columbia. And I was absolutely shocked because the women were wearing bed sheets. I had never seen a sari. I knew nothing about it. I took one course, and the course was about India, China, and Japan. It was a magnificent course. And it was pearls before swine. I had no interest. It was much too difficult. I couldn't remember or pronounce the names. Too much work. Didn't take the second semester. And the teacher was a fellow named Ainsley Embry, who I reconnected with in recent years. And this past week, Ainsley died. I guess he was 96. He was to the end, almost to the end, quite withered. And as a matter of fact, in one of my books, he wrote 2 of the chapters. These were the chapters about the political history of the Viceroy, Lord Reading, and Sir Edwin Montagu, who's the Secretary of State for India and the author of the famous Montague Chelmsford reforms, great figure in Indian history, both which were Jews. This was a time right after World War I where the Indian rupee notes were signed by a Baghdadi Jew, and the two chief officials were both Jews. And the Assistant Secretary of State was also a Jew. So when I started studying these paintings, it all was very simple. I mean, first of all, how much could there possibly be to know about paintings? Some are Hindu, some are Muslim. One guy is blue, the other guy is blue. How much could you possibly need to know? What I discovered quite quickly is that this painting, I can tell you what year it was taken by the patron's son and given to a different Maharaja. You're saying, wait, how would you know that? Well, everybody who collects Indian paintings knows these arcane facts that nobody else knows. When I started looking into other things, I came up with an interesting thing, a different way of looking at things. That the more things you collect, the more types of things, the more holes that you see. Because if I took all the different things that I collected about Kangra and put them in chronological order, you'd see all the gaps. So what are those? First of all, that this was a dynasty that claimed about 450 rulers, that they went back to mythical times where there was 200 and some odd rulers supposedly in this dynasty before Krishna. That King Porus, who fought Alexander the Great, was there. That they had, even though they were off over here, they had Jalandhar, a big place in the Punjab. So that I got from the genealogist. Then I looked at the coin people, and the coin people said, wait a second, you have to look at these 13th century coins. Then when I looked at the Mughal historians, they talk about the capture of the great fort of Kangra and how important that was. So then I went to speak to stamp people and said, where are the Kangra stamps? Well, there are no Kangra stamps because Kangra became part of British India. And the only time anybody ever mentions them, there was an earthquake there in 1905, and you can get 5 million postcards of the 1905 earthquake, which got everybody's interest. So with this in mind, I started doing a series of exhibits using my collection. No, not starting a narrative, but using my collection. And Kangra played a role in this. Well, it turned out that if you needed eye operations in the 16th century in India, you went to this faraway place. And only the few people who were interested in Indian medical history knew about this. And as people keep on saying, well, everybody knows this, but nobody does know this unless you're in that arcane field. And so this was an exhibit that I'm planning to redo on medicine in Maharajas and medical pluralism in India. And a lot of Jews get into the act in this too. So how do I get involved? The mechanic's son goes off to India and he meets all these Maharajas. And this is how you're treated, the way I like to be treated. And maybe I had an ancestor. Here's an 18th century style painting. My wife and I are in there in our previous life. I don't think I'll tell you what I think my previous life was, and it wasn't as a Maharaja, but I will tell you. And everybody starts treating us this. My friend takes a stamp of Jalawar State from my collection. He makes it into my picture of me. And even my poor wife gets the Rani of Jhansi. So all of a sudden, we're Indian royalty. We're moving on up. It's like the Jeffersons. So the one thing happened a few years ago, and we didn't go. And after we didn't go and we saw what this was, we vowed never to miss any opportunity, no matter how difficult. Time is passing. You never know what's going to happen. And this was a marriage of the Prince of Jodhpur, the Crown Prince. And there were about 300 or 400 guests, and we were invited. And Judith Dench, Sting, Mick Jagger, and this is what we missed. Okay. And overnight train between Jaipur and Jodhpur, and there they are with some of the ceremonies, and you see a lineup of Maharajas and Nawabs at the ceremonies. So this was a marriage. The princess was from Ashkot. And how many of you have heard of Ashkot? Well, people know that I'm interested in all these weird places. And so people kept on asking me. Scholars kept on asking me. I've never heard of this place. It's a very tiny place. And of course, I knew the answer. And people were amazed I knew the answer. And I knew the answer because there was a Jew who was escaping from Hitler who was there. So I had read his autobiography, and immediately I knew where the place was. So there was no mystery. And this goes to the thing, whether it's on the walls of the Indian embassy or elsewhere, everywhere I went, I always find a Jew. There are no Jews in India, but there are Jews everywhere in India. Same thing happened. Some of you may have visited the Lake Palace in Udaipur, and here we are with the Maharana. And in one of the books, he writes about an architect, a Jewish architect from Chicago. And if you read his chapter in the book, you'll find out very simply how how this Jewish guy saved his inheritance. This is written by Sriji the Maharana himself. Everywhere I looked, Jews were everywhere. The first exhibit I did in 1989 was at the Cardinal Spellman Philatelic Museum about India, about Maharajas. How did Jews get into the picture? Well, if you look at the lower right-hand corner, you'll see there's a famous Maharaja, Ganga Singh, probably the greatest Maharaja of the 20th century. And somebody came up to me. His son is in the audience. Could you stand, Andrew? Okay. His father comes up to me in Massachusetts on a thing about Maharajas and says, when I was a little boy, I was in Bikaner. His father was a Holocaust refugee as a small boy in Bikaner, which had Jewish doctors. So how did I get on the story of the first Beni Israel synagogue, 1796? It's quite well known. I first hear about this place when I'm studying Tipu Sultan of Mysore. Now, Mysore is nowhere near this synagogue, and it turns out that the guy who built the synagogue was captured by Tipu Sultan, and according to the story, the legend, which I don't think is true, they were about to kill him, and somehow the Sultan's mother found out that he was a Beni Israel and wanted to see a Beni Israel, the people in the Quran, mentioned so favorably in the Quran. And that's supposedly the story. So this synagogue was built with the money that he got. There was still a time when you had prize money. And you can still visit it today in Bombay. And what you see is in 3 languages, you see the inscription when the synagogue was rebuilt in 1860. So this led me to look at things very differently. Basically, I decided to have an exhibit that included everything. There were stories of individual Jewish communities. There were also individual Jews, many of whom had nothing at all to do with Judaism, who individually made great contributions to India. And if you just looked at the communities, you would miss all these people. So there I am at the Ministry of Culture commissioned me to do an exhibit at the Indira Gandhi National Center for the Art. And there is the Israeli ambassador and M.K. Akbar, the Minister for External Affairs, at the exhibit. And it consists of 2 parts, the Jewish communities and contributions of Indian and foreign Jews. And I've just published the 3rd volume. Now, I started with the individual contributions, and I'm going to do 9 volumes, 3 more of which are pretty much done. And this is what you'd carry as a guidebook if you wanted to see the Jewish sites in India, in Bombay, and the area there. You'd go to the David Sassoon Library, who's a Baghdadi Jew. You see a Sassoon Synagogue in Bombay, the Sassoon Synagogue in Pune. But you'd also see the oldest Jewish community, the Beni Israel, and I'll say a little bit about them. And both in Mumbai and in the coast, you see all these different synagogues. In small villages, there are all these synagogues. This is in Alibag. And as we went down the coast, and there I am with the Jewish fellow who, standing to my left, who guided us. And on the right-hand side, you see Pushkar Sahani, who was then at the University of Pennsylvania, who was my co-author. But in the center, there's something that is very shocking. Now, we're in a place called Marud. How many of you have heard of Marud? Anybody from Bombay, maybe? A few of you. But nobody else. And in Marud is the palace of the Nawabs of Janjira, who were African Muslims. There were 5 synagogues within their territory. At one point, they had a Jewish prime minister. So we went to visit him and his wife. And India, there's only 50 people. There's not a billion people. And they all know each other. So a few weeks ago, I was in London, and an Indian guy from Indore, which is nowhere near Marud, comes up and says, I understand you visited my aunt. I said, well, who's your aunt? That's his aunt. So Janjira was only one of the places where Africans were rulers, prime ministers in general, and the exhibit that I've done has been over 40 sites, everywhere from Guyana to Oslo, because this talks about the agency of people. And in India, you find things that you never expect. For example, in Bengal, the Nawabs of Murshidabad, they're descended from Mir Jaffa, who some of you may know in Indian history, a famous figure and villain in Indian history. These are Muslims. And one of them is the daughter of an African concubine, one of the Nawabs. And the last Nawab's wife was named Moselle Meyer. She was Jewish. You're not going to see that every day. So if I talk about the Beni Israel community, it originated in the area near Bombay, but it's scattered to places like Ahmedabad and Karachi. And there was another Baghdadi community in Calcutta. And I haven't even spoken about the old communities, and there's several different communities in the Cochin area. What you get out of all this is that Jews have been coming to India for a long time in small numbers, that they didn't only come from Baghdad, they came from Egypt. We know this because we have in the synagogue in India, in Egypt, there are thousands and thousands of letters that they wrote to India when they came, 1200 AD, 1100 AD. This is the biggest resource to understand the Indian Ocean sea trade, is this cache of letters in general. And so we can't really say that these people were only Baghdadis. They came from Aleppo and other places like that as well. So you have several of these Jewish communities that are fully Jewish. And this is the sexpot actress Nadira. And this is the first exhibit that I did on Jews in Bollywood. The first Indian superstar, female superstar, was Sulochana. She was Jewish. The guy who wrote the first Indian talkie was Jewish. There was Nadira. There was Pramila, whose sister Romila was also a star. And I put up an article I wrote, a picture of Ramallah. I didn't know there were 2 Jewish actors, Romila and Ramola. And so Romila and Pramila also had a cousin who was also an actress. And Jews were all over the place. The guy who made the most documentaries in the whole world was Ezra Mir, who came from Calcutta. In contrast to the film industry, where the Jews who participated were Indians, most of the Jewish artists in India were foreign Jews. So I was very interested in the way foreign Jews made contributions to South Asia. If you look at this cover of my book, you'll see 3 interesting things. Number 1, there are money from Portugal and a stamp from Pakistan. Now, the top figure there is Garcia de Orta, the father of tropical medicine, who at one point owned what was to become Bombay, South Bombay, at that time, because there were islands. It's not filled in as it is today. He's a great hero of Portugal, even though After he died, the Inquisition dug up his bones and burned them. In Pakistan, there are two of Pakistan's greatest artists were Jews. And in the lower right-hand corner is a guy who started out as a Jewish guy who started out as a Russian revolutionary, and he developed the cholera and plague vaccines. And you can go and see the Half-Kind Institute in Bombay today. So these are all contributions. And one of the things that I noticed is when you went back to Garcia de Orta and Half-Kind, and then the Holocaust refugees like the fellow I mentioned in Bikanir, that all the Jews who seemed to make great contributions to medicine were in fact victims of prejudice themselves, which I thought was an interesting finding. Everywhere you look, there was a Jewish contribution. If you want to look at the Sikh community, you'll find out the Khalsa Heritage Center was built by Moshe Safdie. And one of the most extraordinary things that the ambassador and I talked about often was General Ventura. General Ventura was a French general, Jean-Baptiste Ventura. Only trouble is his real name was Reuben Bentora, and he was an Italian. Believe me, he was Jewish because we found his birth certificate in Italy and so on and so forth, and we know that he was arrested for being a Jew and a Bonapartist. And he was the chief of the Sikh armies in the last days. And so one of the adventures that Navtesh and I had was this great Sikh conference at the Library of Congress. And we got him, we got Ajazuddin, who was just here from Lahore. And it was just an amazing thing, and the ambassador did a wonderful job. And of course, being the ambassador, you know, being this hard-nosed sort of diplomat, he talked about love stories. Now I'd like to call him up to read the next two slides. This is the story of the first night we met. Please.
When we read that one.
Yes. Very well written.
How did children from a European country end up in an Indian wartime camp? One such story is of the children of Jamnagar, a few of whom I first met 25 years ago in Warsaw, where they formed a club under the umbrella of the Indo-Polish Friendship Society. In 1989, the Jamnagar club decided to produce a huge plaque, which they planned to send to India and have it installed on a school wall in Balachaddi, a few miles from Jamnagar. The inscription in Polish and Hindi paid homage to the beloved land of Jamnagar, which gave shelter to Polish children during difficult wartime years. I was drafted. I was a young first secretary in Warsaw. I was drafted to go to the factory and ensure that the Devanagari lettering was correctly depicted. Now, this plaque is, I believe, now on the wall of the school in Balachaddi in Jamnagar. All right, this is something which I think I wrote somewhere else and Ken has dug it out. I suppose any war has hundreds and thousands of untold stories, each waiting for a storyteller to come along and find them somewhere, in some aging memory, tucked away in yellowing letters, fighting dust and mold in some filing cabinet. And when they feel that the discerning eye and the deserving heart of the right narrator is finally nigh, they gush forth, often astounding the narrator with their bottled-up passions, the twists and turns of which they are born, the brushes with destiny, the bundles of coincidences that make up life. The years passed, the nugget of that story stayed with me. I mentioned it to the amazing Dr. Kenneth Robbins, a researcher and scholar par excellence of many things, but most relevantly for my purpose, of princely Indian states and Jewish heritage in India. He went after the story with practiced dedication and clarified many aspects. His wife, Joyce, later jokingly blamed me for spoiling a year of her husband's sleep. That's how we met.
That's how we met. That was the first night we met. And it's all been uphill from there. So what was this story about Balachati? This is a place near Jamnagar. It was a summer capital of the Jam Sahib. And it was a camp for Polish refugees. And indeed, there were refugees there. And this is one of them. And the course that they took is when the Poles, when Poland was raped by Stalin and Hitler, I don't know if I can say that, but I did, a lot of Poles were taken out and taken into the Soviet Union. And when the Soviet Union came in on our side, on the American side, they were repatriated by the Poles and taken down through Tehran and wound up in refugee camps. But there were only a few Jewish refugees there. And so what I did is I met Jan Sedlicki, who was the Association of Poles in India. He was at a different Polish refugee camp in India. There were Poles, there were Greeks, there were all sorts of refugees all over India put in by the British. And Polish refugees were literally all around the world from Mexico to Kenya. People don't realize how many people were in exile. And the other fellow is a close friend of mine, Raj Patel, and he was the old boy of the Sainik School in Balachati, which is on the site where this camp was. It was a camp for orphan children run by a Polish priest. The most recent adventure that we had was at my old stamping ground in the Taj Mahal Hotel in New Delhi. And you can tell who I am. I'm the only guy without a turban or a yarmulke. And Navtesh is there with his son, who is an amazing fellow as well. This is his wife. And we're there with the chief rabbi of the Commonwealth, who's come on a visit. And this is my old staking ground, the Taj Mahal Hotel in New Delhi. But we were off with the chief rabbi at the famous Cochin synagogue. So what is the famous story that India tells? It tells that in about 1000 AD, Jews were given special royal privileges, and there were copper plates, that in 1968, that India issued a stamp commemorating the idea of the long-term tolerance and acceptance of Jews in Cochin. Very simple story. The families of the Maharajas of Cochin were always very close to the Jews, and the back of the synagogue overlooked the backyard of one of the palaces. This story was so important that in the 17th century, when Manasseh ben Israel impugned Cromwell to readmit Jews legally to England, he said, "They're doing it in Cochin. Why can't you do it in England?" There's always been a symbol of acceptance. So that's a simple story. Does everybody understand the story? So my granddaughter will said to you already that I'm going to tell you the same story, but I'll tell it to you my way, so you won't understand it, and it'll be very confused and complicated. So here I am, back in my Taj Mahal Hotel. This is where I love to meet people. I sit there, and livery butlers constantly bringing me my Coke Zeros and my cashew nuts, and meeting different people. And so in the past year or so, I've met everybody from the former president of Afghanistan and his son to rabbis and government officials and so on and so forth. And all of a sudden, I get this mysterious email. And you can see, I guess you can figure out which one is the guy who's the guru. Do anybody know who the other guy is? I'm not sure. I've never met him. Well, we did meet him. But I get this email from this mysterious guru in Chennai saying that he wants to meet me in New Delhi because he's received information from Babu of the synagogue in Ernakulam, and he wants to meet me. So this is a story of Sri Hari Prasad of Chennai in the synagogue in Ernakulam, and who was Babu in the synagogue. And the guru and I did not know each other, yet immediately I knew his family. How do you meet somebody, some guru from Chennai, and you know their family? That never happens to me in Washington. I've lived here most of my life. So here's the guru with Babu the Jew in the synagogue. And he's going to restore this synagogue. But this is not where the story begins. That's the conclusion. The beginning of the story comes with the Cochin royal family. And so the first times I went down to Cochin, I went exploring for Jewish sites with my friend Anujan, who's a member of the Cochin royal family. And India being what it is, he kept on wanting to take me places I didn't want to go. One of which was, I want you to come home and see my pet. I don't care about dogs. I have a son who cares about dogs, but I didn't need to see his pet. Next thing we know, we're at this house, and he's saying we should get on his elephant. And another time, he took us to a temple, and 5 elephants paraded inside of the temple before us, and then they turned and all saluted us. This doesn't happen to me, usually. So Anujan and I went out exploring on Jew Street, and he says, I know this area, there's no synagogue here, and so on and so forth. We come there, we find this sign for a synagogue. The gate is locked. We look around. We finally found the new menorah kashet shack. Guy says, I'll take you into the synagogue. He takes us around the corner, and we're hollering at him, we want to go to the synagogue. And he says, no, no, no. He insists upon taking us into Cochin Blossoms, where they're selling tropical fish and flowers. And we're screaming at this guy because we want to go to the synagogue. Well, if you went one room further, you'd see that's the synagogue. So there were 2 synagogues on that block. In fact, the street where the famous synagogue is the third of the fourth of the 4, the third oldest of the 4 synagogues that were once on that block. So here is my friend Babu, who runs the synagogue and Tropical Blossoms, and where we are years later at the Cochin Royal Palace. And Anujan gets my wife again with the elephants. And here's how they greeted us when I arranged for them to get an award, with 3 elephants and a band. And even more impressive was almost everybody in this audience was a member of the Cochin royal family. They came literally from everywhere from Australia to Seattle for the ceremony to get a special award for humanitarian award. But we weren't finished yet. I also arranged to give a humanitarian award to this royal family, the Palyam family, led by the Palyak Achin of Chinnamangalam. Now, this is a very interesting story because the palace is in the center, and at every corner there's a religious site: synagogue, temple, mosque, church. So what is happening now in trying to create a tourist route, it's called the Maziris route, all of the synagogues in that area are part of the synagogue route, of the tourist route, show the tolerance in India. So again, you're wondering what happened to the guru and Babu. So who is the guru? What's the connection? Well, it turns out that the mysterious guru is a member of this family. So I'm speaking to him and saying, where do you originally come from, and so on and so forth. I said, I just left your uncle. So I have this feeling continually in India that when I meet somebody, I know their relatives, I know their friends, and I don't have that feeling in Washington, because Washington is obviously much bigger than India. So that's the story of the guru in the synagogue with Babu the Jew. So then there's a question of, can foreign artists make Indian art? Can people from minority groups make Indian art? Is a piece of art Indian art because of its subject matter or style? So I found 13 artists of Jewish, female artists, ranging back to the 18th century, who were of Jewish or part Jewish ancestry. I try to combine this with another story. the story of the mythical Jew Zen Kohen, who writes Jewish koans. And the question is, why are so many Jews involved in the religious and spiritual traditions of other people? How does this happen? We got our standard Hindus, our Jubus, and Mujus. And there have been a lot of Mujus. And I picked two of these artists to tell you about, one of which is still alive, the woman on the right-hand side, Carmel Bergson. She's 92, still sculpturing, spent most of her life in India. And the other is a French Jew who family came from the Ottoman Empire, who was an artist who became India's greatest foreign-born guru, the mother. So the mother in India is a Jewish mother. So I divided these artists into two groups. One are the people who continued their connections to both India and being Jewish. Three of those were artists like Siona Benjamin, who's shown here, who were from the Beni Israel community. And the fourth is Carmel Bergson. Now, Carmel Bergson was a scholar and a photographer, and here she is getting one of the highest awards from the President of India. Very important figure. She identifies strongly with her Jewish heritage. Part of this is her father was chief of education for the Jewish Agency in Palestine in the 1930s. And he's the one who derived the method of training Jewish children by after school and on Sunday schools rather than in day schools, to try to help create a multi-ethnic, unhomogenized type of community. And these are her photographs of Indian Jews that were shown in Tel Aviv. Now, when she goes into the cave temple, she experiences a sense of being whole, of timelessness, and so on and so forth. And she's trying to not produce in her own sculpture and in her own things, analysis, the idea of just seeing something and making a photograph of it, but creating a synthesis of shape, form, and space. She's written great books about Indian mythology and portrayed it in her own sculptures. The second category that I made up was those people who either entered other religious traditions or became secular intellectuals where they could never be found within a synagogue. The most important of which was Freda Brilliant, who made about 30 or 40 sculptures of every Indian leader you can possibly imagine. You know the big statue of Gandhi in London? She made it. Here she is doing Nehru, and her statue of Krishna Menon is one of the world's greatest things. I think if you put this and you just walk around it, every little time you walk a slight thing, the total expression changes. You can see the man's whole character as if he has 50 different characters. It's an amazing piece of work. But there were artists who joined other faith traditions. One of those was Anna Malka Ahmed, who became a Muslim. She was a British Jew. And so in the book that I'm working on, I've covered all the Jews who contributed to Islam in South Asia. The founder of the Madar Sufis came from Aleppo. I visited his shrine. He has literally hundreds of different shrines all over India and South Asia. The Samad, the great Sufi poet of the 17th century, and the Islamic scholar, Pakistani diplomat Muhammad Asad, who was born Leopold Wolf. In Riyadh, there was just a big conference in his honor. So part of the sign of the liberalization of Saudi Arabia was the fact that the Saudi royal family, who had supported him in the past, and actually helped sponsor Sheikh Yemeni, sponsored his translation of the Quran. But the most famous, of course, is the mother. And this is her self-portrait. She grew up in a wealthy neighborhood in Paris. Her brother, who became governor of French colonies in the West Indies and Africa, was also quite well known, but she was an artist. And her uncle was married into another Turkish Jewish family, the Commandos, who left this wonderful museum in Paris. So who was this woman? She became a guru. She had one extremely famous ancestor. It's a famous North African rabbi called the Rif, Isaac El-Fazi. And his work, the so-called Little Talmud, is still famous and used today. And if you had to say, in medieval times, there were two Jews who were really the most important. They were Yehuda HaLevi, who was his student, and Maimonides. And one of his students was the teacher of Maimonides' father. So this was an important person in Jewish life. She goes off to a place in Algeria. Why does she go off to Algeria, which then is part of France? Saying, Algeria? Well, she had ancestors who came there. And when I did my research, I found out there was a famous pilgrimage site to another rabbi there. So I figured this is why she went. As far as I can determine, it had nothing at all to do with Judaism. It had to do with meeting this guy, Max Theon. Max Theon was the son of a rabbi from Warsaw. He also was in Algeria. What were these people doing in Algeria? I still don't understand why. And this is her drawing of Max Theon and the place where they studied. These people were developing in the 19th century cosmic philosophy. This philosophy had to do with the idea that before we had individual religions, that there was this cosmic knowledge that everybody had, and that you could recapture parts of it in things like Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. And this is why Theosophy was part of the same kind of movement. And this is where she studied. And she made paintings of her spiritual quest. From the age of 4, she was meditating and having out-of-body experiences. She was just a little girl, and already she was having these experiences. She often would see herself in a golden robe, rising up as people gathered to be comforted and healed. She had dreams of meeting a dark man who was Krishna. And they did meet, the famous guru Aurobindo. And Aurobindo saw her as the mother figure and established her. And here's her painting of divine consciousness. Now, she tried to draw a parallel between yogis and artists to see things as more complete and conscious than ordinary people. So this is a drawing that she made for a child about yoga. And she said the path of yoga is straight up, a straight line, whereas most people's lives go in all sorts of directions, and they really don't go up. But these weren't the only people. And as I finish up, I want you to understand that there's an important thing for today. The contributions of Jewish refugees in the 1940s to India, 30s and 40s, was extraordinary. Among these was one of the greatest expressionist dancers, Hilda Hogar. The middle picture was taken in Juhu Beach. All the artists that you see today, Ara, Raza, the progressive artist movement, the most important artists, were all mentored by Jewish refugees. And here from my collection is one of those Jewish refugees, a painting by Raza, and she helped him get to Paris to get his training. There were other artists who at one time were extremely well known. Magda Nachman was the artist, and very few of her paintings remain. Most of them have been lost, and the name has been lost to collectors. She was one of the most important painters at that time. And I was speaking to a friend of mine, Maya, could you stand up? And I said, I'm searching for paintings. And she said, oh, she painted me, and she painted 3 of my friends when I was a little girl. Now, her husband plays a role in this story too, and this is where I'm going to end. He introduced me to one of my close friends, it was a boyhood friend of his. I introduced him about a year ago at Columbia University School of Public Health, and the professor estimated that indirectly or directly he saved between 10 and 13 million lives. How did he do this? With his PhD from Cambridge, he was a Nobel Prize winner, he figured out how to retro-engineer drugs and create inexpensive generic drugs, saving all these lives. And what is interesting about his history is he was born in Vilna. And why was he born in Vilna? Because his father went with his friend, Zakir Hussain, who later became president of India, and they went to Germany, and there they met local Jewish women. And this fellow who was a descendant of the Emir of Afghanistan and the Jewish communists got married in a mosque and a synagogue. So I have to write about him in two things: Holocaust refugees and Muslims and Jews in South Asia. So my last slide is, in India, one always meets different people. He was walking along the street. My friend took a picture of us together. Thank you so much.
We now have time for Q&A. Those of you who would like to ask some questions, give me a minute. Let me arrange the mics.
Don't knock it over.
My name is Mike with the Center for Pluralism. There were 3 additional things you may have missed or you may add in the future.
Please.
One of the most famous Indian comedian actors was David. He was Jewish. And then the last 12th tribe was found in Assam, the northeast part of India. Then the third one is in Bombay, still today, there is a Muslim who writes the headstones in Hebrew, and he's continuing the tradition with his son. Apparently, Israel is taking him back to Israel there. So I just wanted to add those
I
three
think those
things.
are 3 excellent things. David made about 250 pictures, and he sometimes worked on 3 and 4 pictures at the same time. His most famous role was in boot polish, and one of my favorite things in my collection is a movie poster from Israel of David in boot polish. And the second point that you made is that there are now emerging Judaizing communities. They have been emerged in the 20th century in areas where there were Christian missionaries. Around Gunta is the B'nai Ephraim, and the B'nai Menashe are various groups in Mizoram, Manipur, Assam, and the northern Shan states. And there was a third thing that you said? The tombstones. This is maybe the most important thing, and if I can just take a minute, because I think this, if I was boring before, this at least will be interesting. What is amazing when you go to India is you go to Jewtown and you find that one of the last Paradisi Jews is senile, and who's taking care of her? A young Muslim boy who's doing it out of the goodness of his heart. Everybody should have a son like him. There is one Hebrew calligrapher. He's also working as on the Gulf as a cook in a Taj hotel, and he does the Hebrew calligraphy. There's this fellow that you're mentioning who does the tombstones, and most of the cheap Jewish menorahs and things like that that come out of India are made in Moradabad by a guy whose name is Mohammed. The most extraordinary thing is I have a very close friend who's a Muslim nobleman. His name is Mir Jaffa Imam. And about the 3rd or 4th time I met him, I'm sitting in his house in Mumbai on Apollo Bunder, looking out at the thing. I'm looking at the pillars, and there are swastikas. So now I'm sitting with a Muslim guy with swastikas in his house. So I'm saying, no, these are Hindu swastikas. They're not Hindu swastikas. So I'm saying, how do I deal with this? I mean, the man is very nice to me. I'm sitting with a Muslim guy who has swastikas. So I start to ask him, and he says, I'll take you around the house. He shows me there's swastikas inside the house, outside the house, all over the place. He says, don't say anything. He said, in 1939, when the German guy left, my grandmother had loved this house, and my grandfather bought it. So next thing you're going to ask me is, why didn't I get rid of the swastikas? So he says to me, one of our closest friends was Sophie Kelly. what kind of name is Sophie Kelly? She was one of the leaders of the Baghdadi community of Mumbai. Kelly, okay. But she was. And she was his godmother, and she said, you don't get rid of these things. They're there for history. So whenever a member of the Jewish community, the Bene Israel, launch a book or have a thing, they launch it from his house. He is also restoring the synagogue, the cemetery in Surat, which dates to the 17th and 18th centuries. So that's my Muslim friend with the swastikas.
Thank you. My name is Rhoda Septilisi, and my parents were rescuers during the war. Especially the story of the Kamodo connection touched my heart. I wanted to thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. And my quick question is, the more ancient waves of migration were Sephardim, I assume, from your story? And then perhaps Ashkenazis from Warsaw and other places?
Yes.
Thank you so much.
And I think people ask what year they came, and the point is that small numbers were coming throughout history. And they didn't only come from Baghdad. In fact, they were coming before there was a Baghdad. And we're ignoring the amount that came from Yemen, the ones who came from Aleppo. The founder of the Baghdadi community in Calcutta was from Aleppo. The guy who started the Sufi order in the 15th century, he was from Aleppo. We also have a Persian Judaic script on copper plates from 849, I think it is, which Jews, Muslims, Christians, and Hindus are getting together to protect the church. 9th century. How many times have you seen that? I mean, can you think of a single example from Europe? I can't. So,
Next question to the gentleman there. Thank you. Please state your name, sir.
Yes, I'm Rajesh Kadian.
Hi, Raj.
And Ken, another wonderful presentation. Thank you. I talked with the 1940s, but I think in the 1940s, most of the refugees were taken by princely states in India.
Yes.
Now, was that because British India opposed refugee camps within British India vis-a-vis princely India? Because you see the same sort of an earlier development with the white Russians who moved from Shanghai to the British Indian Empire. So maybe they were also mostly Jewish.
I think that the thing was that the princely states had a situation where the Maharaja or the prime minister could say thumbs up or thumbs down. So the Maharaja of Patiala said, I want to have x-ray equipment and I want to have a great doctor here. He got one from Vienna, and the guy started an institute and brought along with him, and they started a symphony orchestra. So there was that kind of thing. Also, there was a lot of conflict for the doctors, because of the official record, about 7% of them were doctors of the community, and there was a lot of fighting about that these were taking away our patients. And so the guys were lucky with the Germans because they had Italian degrees, and there was reciprocity, whereas the German universities and the Indian universities had no reciprocity. So those guys who had German and Viennese certificates were out of luck.
अगले प्रश्न करता मेरा आपसे आग्रह है, कृपया अपने प्रश्नों को वक्तव्य न बनाएं, प्रश्नों तक रहने दें. Anybody asking a question, please do not make it a statement. Ask the question. Thank you. The lady there, please. Thank you.
My name is Seema Bali, and I was supposed to Google this before I got here, but now I'm just going to ask you. Is there any kind of either collaboration or overlap with the Parsi community with the Judaic? For a long time, I thought they were the same, so I would love to hear what you're...
I think what you're talking about is a very important thing. When you go and you look at the actresses, for example, and so on and so forth, it's sometimes very hard to know what somebody's ancestry was. For example, one actress with a Hindu stage name, her name is Irene Glasper, and people say she's an Armenian Jew. I don't know whether she was Jewish or not. In terms of the relationship between the Parsi community and the Baghdadi Jews, it was very strong. And they were both merchants and so on and so forth. And you can find in a Baghdadi part in the JJ Hospital. And the Parsi theater was just such an important part of this. And there were Jews who participated in this. One was Joseph David Penkar, who wrote the first Indian talkie, Alam Ara, who I like him better because he created a whole genre of movies with Fearless Nadia. Hunter Wally was his creation. And he wrote other plays called Maccabee and so on and so forth. But the most interesting character was this guy, a Muslim, who wrote a play called Yehudi. And that was converted into 4 separate movies with somewhat different plots. So you have your choice of Yehudi movies.
Thank you so much, sir. I mean, you just feel like going on and on with the way, all these memories that you brought back. And on all our behalves, I think he deserves a big round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And before I bring the formal part of the evening to an end, may I humbly request Ambassador of India to present a bouquet of flowers as a token of my appreciation.
I'm going to present it with joy. Oh, good.